Means of egress. This chapter covers exiting. Our current code isn't really very clean with the terms it uses. Everything's an exit, 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 exit. Exit is a very specific thing in the model codes. It's when you get to the enclosed part of the means of egress. So moving towards the national terminology is hopefully going to clear some things up. We're also going to move towards the IBC-based way of measuring exit width, so goodbye units of exit width and hello multiplier, based on whether you have a sprinkler system or not. The number of exits is also going to be cleared up. The separation between exits is going to be based on the IBC, but with some exceptions that we've recognized for a long time where it isn't possible to meet those absolute percentage or fraction of the diagonal requirements. Means of egress illumination, that's an area where we're moving towards some more clarity there, but there's still some Chicago-specific requirements, mostly in our electrical code about emergency lighting. Accessible means of egress, that's going to help us integrate with the accessibility code and increase compliance there and really be not have conflicting standards about exiting and means of egress for stairs, ramps, things like that. Then the middle part of the chapter has some specific requirements about egress features, then the egress path components, and then at the end of the chapter there's some special provisions about assembly, occupancies, rooms like this, or the spaces with large groups of people gathered have some specialized requirements about aisles and seating and things like that. So the IBC-based egress sizing, IBC-based egress terminology, the IBC-based egress separation with some Chicago exceptions, clarifications, and for small residential, there are some reduced railing and guard requirements. So we are going to recognize for small residential buildings 36-inch guards, which we haven't recognized before, but consistent with the national model codes there. So some places will no longer be required to have 42-inch guards. And just an illustration of the sort of terms that apply to the means of egress, which are important to understand for reading through this chapter. And if, so the means of egress starts in an occupiable space at the most remote point in that space, so that far corner of the room. It leads out to the exit access, so corridors, open stairs, open ramps are going to be part of the exit access, and they also include the travel distance in the occupiable space. Then you get to the enclosed portion, it's the exit. So it can be an exit stair, it can be an exit corridor, but that is going to be the enclosed portion with limited penetrations, really only for accessing it for exiting purposes. And then you are going to get outside, and then the portion from getting from the end of that enclosed exit to the public way is going to be called the exit discharge. It could be a yard, it could be a lobby in some cases in Chicago, and Chicago's requirements did keep more choices to have exit stairs, exit through a lobby because of our weather conditions, and we have allowed that for a long time. And then it leads out to a public way, so street, alley, other public space. The occupant load factors are going to be a hybrid of current Chicago conditions and IBC conditions. There's some things in our code today that are so old they're new again. For example, in business occupancies, I think in 1949 when our code was written, you had typing pools and office staff working in very close quarters, then people spread out, and so the model code has a less dense standard for business occupancies, but what we're seeing today in terms of the co-working spaces, the WeWorks and so on of the world, everyone is squeezing those office workers in tighter. So we are keeping our 100 square foot per person standard for business occupant load. Door swing restrictions, we've been more restrictive in Chicago, and that stays more restrictive. Single exit conditions are going to be much more similar to Chicago and less like the IBC. So the IBC recognizes some single exit conditions from a story in non-residential occupancies. This code will not, so they are spelled out much in the way that 13160.050 A through O exceptions are spelled out today, those single exit conditions. But that also means that we aren't having egress windows in residential occupancies. It's more based on traditional types of means of egress or exits and less reliance on people going out a window that probably in Chicago opens on a very narrow side yard. And then there's some features about egress that we chose not to adopt. Glow-in-the-dark exit markings, which sound neat, but in other jurisdictions that have been living with that requirement for 10 years, they tell us that they wear out and have to be replaced, and they're just sort of a nightmare and probably don't add a lot to safety. Pressurized stairs, as I mentioned, are not going to come in as a requirement in Chicago. Some model code-based requirements for third stairs and very tall high-rises do not come in because our elevator community does not believe that the trade-off occupant evacuation elevators really would work. So if there wasn't a trade-off, we weren't going to mandate that third stair. Smoke-protected seating in the assembly chapter, there are some allowances in the model IBC for when you have a smoke control system, changing the requirements for the design of seating sections, and we did not adopt that here, again, because of deferring some of those questions about smoke control systems to when we look at our mechanical code. And as I mentioned, the residential egress windows are not coming in as a requirement. For accessibility, we went back and forth on this, but we're very excited to say that we were able to work with the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities and adopt some updated accessibility requirements. I think the mayor really deserves a lot of credit for forcing everyone to the table to get this done. I think it's a big accomplishment. There were some changes in state law late last year that are phasing in through later this year. This tries to capture those in our code, which we knew we were going to need to do. It's also going to coordinate with some other changes that have been out there, or some concerns that were out there about our current code not being fully consistent with the ADA or the Fair Housing Act regulations for some residential occupancies. But for the projects that are government funded, MOPD is going to continue to have some extra requirements there. Often it's city money involved, and to protect us, there are probably going to continue to be stricter standards. So if it is a project where the city is involved as a funder in some way, there are going to continue to be stricter requirements around those to protect us from the litigation risk that just exists in this area. And other changes that will happen with this, so all of these take effect December 1st. Again, for projects before December 1st, you're probably going to be working with Chris or our accessibility reviewers and being told that you need to comply with the new Illinois Accessibility Code. This is going to provide a spelled out path that works with our new code, but these accessibility requirements are going to take effect, new code, old code, for everyone, December 1st. It's going to update to use the 2009 edition of the ANSI 117.1 standard as a baseline, which changes a few dimensions around, but fairly minor. And then for people who do residential work, multifamily residential work where you have to have type A units, this provides a new spelled out option for kitchen cabinets, which I think will make a lot of people happy. We think it's consistent with the Illinois Accessibility Code and will not necessarily require some of the strange conditions that people have been building or trying not to build for the last period of time. Interior environment, this chapter covers mostly conditions in residential, some space sizing requirements, but it does address a little bit of everything. So it covers ventilation, temperature control, light, natural light requirements, the sizes of yards and courts to borrow, to use for natural light and ventilation, the interior space dimensions, again, mostly residential, access to unoccupied spaces, so mechanical rooms and things like that, some requirements about toilets and bathrooms, and then some requirements that are in our code today, updated a little bit to be a little more clear and easier to find about rodent protection on certain openings and wall conditions close to the ground. New from IBC are some provisions about attic and crawl space ventilation that we really haven't spelled out very clearly before, and help coordinate with similar provisions in the Energy Conservation Code, which we have adopted. The ceiling height requirement actually comes down consistent with what the model code would require in certain residential occupancies, and some things that New York City has been doing experimentally to allow lower ceiling heights, especially to encourage the reuse of existing basement space or attic space without expensive modifications. So a 7-foot ceiling height is going to be recognized down from our current expectation of 7'6". There are some provisions I mentioned earlier about residential lofts for sleeping purposes. Again, those are modified from International Residential Code provisions that were designed for tiny houses but recognized more broadly here. and then some things about toilet rooms, non-absorbent surfaces, and a new requirement to Chicago urinal partitions. One thing that's in Model Chapter 12 that Chicago did not adopt is sound transmission requirements. So we will continue not to have any standards around sound transmission. That won't be a code expectation. That will be a client-driven expectation in Chicago projects. The provisions about borrowed light and borrowed ventilation still are required, so there is still requirements in residential occupancies and some educational occupancies for natural light and sometimes natural ventilation, but they're modified a little bit based on some things we've been allowing through various alternative approval processes for the last 10 years, and a little more flexibility. So I think there's some exciting things happening there, still required, but some changes. And especially for duplex down conditions and basements, there are some further modifications to allow some conditions where there may not be required natural ventilation if part of the unit is above grade and there's mechanical ventilation provided. Provisions on yards and courts spells that out a little more clearly and modifies them slightly from the conditions today. They are Chicago-based conditions, and they coordinate a little bit with some things in our zoning ordinance, I think. But there may be further room in years ahead for further coordination there. Spelled out in the code and not spelled out entirely how it's going to work, but something to look forward to is recognition of permanent easements. So we've been doing this on a case-by-case basis when there are properties and they want to use part of open space on a neighboring property. If there is a permanent recorded easement, that space is going to stay open and be able to use for that in perpetuity. We will recognize that as being included in that space for various purposes, especially natural light and ventilation. So for some tight developments, that's a benefit. And the other 2 points I think we've already covered. So energy efficiency, this is one of the requirements that's going into effect in just a few weeks, June 1st. We will have new forms up on our website, hopefully in a week or two. So before it goes effect, it takes effect for permit applications that start on or after June 1st. The Chicago cool roof requirements, solar reflectance requirements are moving to the roofing chapter, but they stay in effect after June 1st. This is one area where we're excited that we're finally going to have an energy code and a building code that are talking the same language once we've fully phased this in. So we've had an energy code, and it's been based on the International Energy Conservation Code for a number of years, but there have been challenges around getting everything to meet up in terms of expectations that were in fire requirements about insulation materials, and then increasingly strict expectations about insulating new walls. So I think this code provides a lot more paths to be speaking the same language and comply there in more innovative ways. And one thing, just a reminder out there, so a year or two ago, the state transitioned who the free provider of energy code support, technical support was. It's now provided by the Smart Energy Design Assistance Center at the University of Illinois in Champaign. And they do have a number of webinars, and they're going to be doing a number of live programs again in Chicago after the state budget year resets on July 1st. So later this summer, there will be some free live programs in Chicago, but for now, there's a number of pretty good webinar programs. Number of free webinar programs that are available at smartenergy.illinois.edu.